One. Welcome back, everyone. This is part two of the history of Christianity and how it relates to Judaism and to Israel. We left off, I guess you could say, on a cliffhanger, but we're going to continue today, just like jump right in and hopefully get, a little bit more of a history, the timeline, even though it's so big. But really, what we're trying to do is get to understand what is the relationship between Judaism and Christianity today, both in the positive, but also in the negative. And where did that come from? So, Ken, where should we start? How do we pick up from where we left off last week?
Okay, so yeah, we did leave it as a cliffhanger. We talked about schism in general and the understanding that Christianity emerges out of the schism and the breakaway groups that are in the Jewish world, and the messianism that's always in Jewish consciousness, but always seems to wax and rise in difficult periods of time. The Roman Empire's occupation of Israel and all the revolts and oppression that was caused by that is definitely a period of a lot of schism and a lot of messianism. And we left off, Ellie, last week talking about the historical evidence for the character of Jesus, who's the central figure, of course, in Christianity. And without going back all over that again, we talked about how, even the gospel narrative, the authors are not contemporaneous with Jesus. The earliest ones are decades after, and that Roman historians mention the character of Jesus, but again, not contemporaneously. And even Josephus, the great first century Jewish historian who lived after the accepted death of Jesus, also there's an insertion of one paragraph in there. But the last source I wanted to talk about before we move into the emergence of actual Christianity is the Talmudic sources, like Jewish sources, like the holy books of the Jews. Because I hear rabbis talking about, he's mentioned in the Talmud, there's a character who's called Yeshu HaNotzri. And again, we talked about how there's no Jesus, there's no Mary, there's no Matthew, there's no Luke, there's no John. These are, English versions
Right.
of Latin versions of Greek versions of Hebrew names.
Mm.
So people often like to say, well, Jesus' authentic name was Yoshua, Joshua. We don't know. But this Yeshu name appears in the Talmud.
Mm.
And many people say that he's the one. And he's not portrayed as a very sympathetic character, by the way, by the rabbis in the Talmud. We have to appreciate that Talmudic documents are hundreds of years after. The Talmud is not a historical book. It often speaks very polemically with a lot of stuff hidden in there. So, as I'll explain now, I think it's very dangerous for a lot of reasons to assume that Yeshu HaNotzri character is the Jesus of Nazareth of the Christian Bible. Although the connection, obviously, Yeshu, Jesus, and Nazareth, Notzri. The modern Hebrew word for Christian is Notzri. Um, but does that necessarily mean Christian in the ancient world? So the problem with associating this character, Yeshu HaNotzri, with the Jesus of the Christian Bible is, first of all, there are two of them. One of them is an apostate student of a mid-second century rabbi who was the head of the Sanhedrin called Yoshua ben Prachya. And there's very interesting stories in the Talmud about him, how he, without going into all the details, because of a negative interaction with his rabbi, he goes off the derech, so to speak. He breaks away. He diverges from mainstream Pharisaic Judaism and does all kinds of not so good stuff. Okay, that would put him about 150 years before the birth of the Jesus of the Christian Bible. The other Yeshu HaNotzri character is is the illegitimate son of the wife of a man by the name of Papas ben Yehuda. And he's a character mentioned in the Talmud, and we can place him chronologically because Papas ben Yehuda interacts with Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva, we know, is late first, early second century, great Jewish scholar involved in the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135. In that story, this guy, Papas ben Yehuda, was a real, like, misogynist, wife controlling, not nice guy. He used to lock his wife up when he went off to work every day. And one day she like climbs out the back window of the house, has an affair with a Roman soldier, and gives birth to that Yeshu HaNotzri guy. So neither of these people, and this is early
Well,
second century of the Common Era. So these guys are 300 years apart, approximately, and neither of them fit into the chronology, the timeline of the Jesus that we know from the Christian Bible, nor is there any other real connection. Yeah,
Can
you
I
wanted to ask
just
something?
say though, like it never ceases to blow my mind how authentic the Torah and the Talmud both are in recording like all the crazy stuff we do, like not just like the good stuff we do, but the not great stuff we do. And it just, it never ceases to amaze me. Like if a person said, "Let's write a book that we're going to use in order to follow a religion, and we're going to talk about all of the top people that are part of that religion," at any biography you read today, it's like, here's all the great things they did, and then they shove all the bad things in the closet. And like, we just don't. It's so, in very many ways, non-Christian because we always talk about the bad things that we do and the mistakes that we make as well as the good stuff. So it just never ceases to blow my mind. So I know that's an aside, but it's just wild that they talk about that story in the Talmud at all.
But forget the Talmud. It's, there's the Bible itself has some pretty racy stuff in it. Israel Zangwill, a British Zionist writer from over 100 years ago, he said either the author of the Bible is God or an anti-Semite. There's
Yeah,
no skeletons in the closet because they're all on the stage
none.
with a spotlight on them. Since we're talking about Jesus, and the Gospel of Matthew begins with Jesus's lineage going back to King David through his father, who is Joseph, which is also interesting because according to Christian theology, his father's God. That's another problem. But the Christians want to claim his legitimacy by bringing him back to the house of David, which is the royal bloodline of the Jewish people, and therefore the pedigree of the Messiah has to come from that. But if you look, by the way, in the book of Genesis and in the book of Ruth, where does the house of David come from? It comes from Judah, one of Jacob's sons. Like basically, his daughter-in-law dresses as a prostitute and seduces
Right,
him. He doesn't know it's her. Out of that comes this guy Peretz, this baby. And then you go to the book of Ruth, which is a story of a Moabite woman, and the Moabites are considered so tainted spiritually that male Moabites are not even allowed to marry into the Jewish people. But she ends up having a very short relationship with this guy Boaz, who's this is the descendant of Peretz.
right,
And this is King David. This is King David's lineage. This is the Messiah's lineage. Comes from some
right.
of the raciest stuff. That's
And
very
I think,
interesting.
and I think to me, it speaks so much to a very different way of viewing quote unquote good and evil, because Judaism says that everything comes from God. We don't have this idea that good comes from God and evil comes from Satan. And we don't bifurcate these two things. We say everything comes from Hashem, right? And the shadow parts are things to heal and integrate and learn from and turn the bitter to the sweet. Where I think, if I forgive me if I have this wrong, but I think in the Christian narrative, there's very much this idea that all the good stuff comes from God and all the bad stuff comes from Satan, and we're just supposed to banish it and get rid of it and stay away from it as much as we can and pretend it's not there, or just, you know, be afraid of it. And I think that just has such a different psychological effect on a person's brain when you're able to say, yeah, I did all those things and they were not great. And I learned from them and I became who I am because of those things, which I think Judaism is a unique, um, if you can call it a religion, which we can't really, but it's a unique perspective on life in that way. So that's just an aside. I never cease to be blown away by it.
It's interesting, and not, and even if you look at the origins of Jesus, the whole notion of immaculate conception, which is the notion that the two Marys in the narrative, one is born without sin. There's the idea of original sin, which everyone has except for her,
Mhm.
and she conceives without having sex. So it's
Right.
kind of a much more sort of sanitized, pure view. Judaism is much more, I don't want to say down in the dirt, but it's much more nitty gritty than it's a very interesting way. That whole narrative of that whole story, by the way, is also the origins of the founding of the city of Rome. Speaking about, I'm getting ahead of myself, but the legend of the founding of the city of Rome in the 8th century BCE is about one of the Vestal virgins of Rome, Rhea Silvia, who's raped by the god Mars. Vestal virgins had to stay virgin. So she stays a virgin, but she gets pregnant and she gives birth to twins named Romulus and Remus, who the local god, local king is jealous of their demigod, like Hercules, half god status. So he has them thrown into a river and they're rescued by a wolf and raised by a wolf. That's the official image of the city of Rome is two little babies nursing underneath the bottom of a wolf. And they go and found the city of Rome. And it's just an interesting story. You see the connections between the influence of not just Judaism, but paganism on the origins of Christianity. But if we go back to that story of Yeshu HaNotzri, the only thing that seems to even slightly sound a little bit similar between those two narratives is that the woman in the latter story, her name is Miriam Magdalene Sarah, Miriam the hairdresser, which kind of sounds like Mary Magdalene. But even that isn't really great because Magdala is it doesn't mean hairdresser. It's a fishing village on the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, or the Kinneret, which is where Jesus's ministry is up north, and most of his followers are fishermen from that part of the world.
Yeah,
So you put it
fascinating.
all together based on what we talked about in part one of this and part two. The reality is the historical Jesus exists in a vacuum. There's no direct evidence from historical sources at a historical period of time when there's a lot of people writing about things. So the lack of that seems to be problematic to say the least. So we have to leave that as a question mark because we really can't verify it. But what we do know, what's interesting is what we do have at this period of time already in the first century very clearly is Judeo-Christianity. And I have to explain myself there because this is not Messianic Jews or Jews for Jesus, who are just people who are Jewish by Jewish law, but yet they believe Jesus is the Messiah. These are, again, going back to what we said in the last part, some sort of divergent sect of Messianic Judaism, meaning they followed some sort of spiritual leader they viewed as a Messiah, a la the Jewish definition. Keeping in mind, when I talk about all of this, that any notion of God having relations with women and God having parts, the Trinity idea, which evolves later in Christianity, would be completely anathema and unacceptable to Jewish worldview. Now, how do we know that this exists? Because if you look at the Talmud, speaking about the Talmud, we just spoke about the Talmud, but in Tractate Brachot, page 28b, there's a very famous discussion. Brachot is the first tractate of the Talmud, and it talks about the origin of the formalized prayers that we have within Judaism today that are called the Shmona Esrei, or the 18 benedictions that we say as part of the silent prayer 3 times a day. And in 28b, it says these 18 benedictions are really 19. What does that mean? Rabbi Levi said the blessing against the heretics, which the Hebrew word is minim, which is a classic word for some sort of heretical thinking, was innovated at Yavna. Now, Yavna is around the year 80 CE. This is about 10 years after the destruction of the temple, when the Jewish Supreme Court, also known as the Sanhedrin, had fled from Jerusalem prior to the destruction of the city and moved to Yavna, which will not be its final place. It'll end up in Tiberias hundreds of years later. But in Yavna, right after the destruction of the temple, which was totally traumatic for the Jewish people, when the whole temple service is lost, the ability to connect to God is gone, the rabbis are looking for ways to remember the temple, to keep it fresh, and also to connect spiritually without the temple. And the main purpose of that was the connector place between not just the Jewish people and God, but humanity and God. So they create this formalized prayer structure that we have today. So the Talmud goes on to explain these 18 blessings are really 19, and they added a 19th later. And it says, our rabbis taught, Shimon HaPakoli arranged the 18 benedictions in order before Rabban Gamliel in Yavna. He's the head of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court. After it was finished, Rabban Gamliel said to the sages, quote, is there nobody who knows how to create a blessing against the heretics? Shmuel HaKatan, that's Shmuel Jr., Shmuel II, arose and created it. So they had created these 18 blessings, and then Rabban Gamliel felt we have to add this 19th one in. And it's not really a blessing. I'm going to tell you what it says in a minute. It's interesting. It's really kind of like a curse. And listen to what it says here. It says this is the original version. The ones we have today, there's slightly divergent versions in the prayer books we have today, but this one is much more, as we say in Hebrew, charif. It's sharper. And it's called La Malshinim, which is to the heretics. And then here's the English translation. It says, for the apostates, may there be no hope unless they return to your Torah. And for the Notzrim and the Minim, may they perish immediately. Speedily may they be erased from the book of life and not be registered amongst the righteous. Ooh, notes ream.
That's
That's modern
intense.
Christians. Interesting. So these are two. So what, but forget, put the Christian thing out of the way in the modern Hebrew. We can't bring that in here. It's only very peripherally connected to this. Just as I said, there was splinter sects. The Jewish people, after the destruction of the temple, are in an incredibly precarious position. Central authority is barely hanging in there. The temple is destroyed or being occupied by the Romans, and you have all the schism and splinter sects. And the mainstream rabbis, the Perushim, the Pharisaic Jewish leadership, that is the root of what we call orthodoxy of today, the Torah observant Judaism of today, decides we have to. There are Jews who are praying amongst us who are their hashkafa, their worldview is not correct. And this was designed as a way of A, being a test, meaning they wouldn't stand up and say this about themselves. They'd be cursing themselves. And it was also a way of announcing 3 times a day that their philosophy, they either have to come back to the correct practice of Judaism or get out. It's funny because the Talmud describes how this is, when you do the daily prayers for the morning prayers and the afternoon prayers, the guy who leads the prayers, the shliach tzibur, repeats them. Why does he say them out loud a second time? Because before the printing press, people didn't have books and prayer books. See, if you pray your whole life, you know it by heart. But this is for anyone who didn't know how to pray. He would recite it and you would say Amen, which is attesting to its truth. And it's as if you prayed. So the interesting part of the Talmud is Shmuel HaKatan, who composes this prayer, which is really a curse against these splinter sects. He gets up to pray and he gets to the blessing that he innovated, and he has like a brain fog and he freezes. And they're thinking, oh my God, maybe he's one of them. But
That's wild. Oh my gosh.
so we have people. So initially, we're primarily talking about Jews who were divergent worldview.
Right.
Like the Dead Sea sect that we talked about previously, these are Jews who are basically religious Jews. They're keeping kosher, they're keeping Shabbos, but something about their hashkafa, their worldview, is not straight and not acceptable and considered dangerous. So
Hmm.
this is what exists. But how does that become a major world faith?
Right.
Now we also know that at this time there are pagans. There are pagans who are starting to be attracted to Judaism. Now, this is Jews. Now, we're not just living in Israel at the time. Maybe a third of the Jews in the world before massive killouts of Jews in the Great Revolt of 66 to 70 and the Bar Kokhba Revolt of 132 to 135. But maybe a third of the Jews in the world living in Israel. They're Jews scattered around the Mediterranean. At this time, there are no other monotheistic faiths. Everyone else is a polytheist, and they're swapping gods like baseball cards. And this happens to correspond with really Pax Romana, the height of Roman power. When Rome controls the Mediterranean, they're unchallenged. And the problem with being at the height of your power, and this is what happens with all empires, is the only place to go is down. And when empires kind of lose that aggressive expansionist tendency, they tend to start getting decadent and lazy and contracting. And just like we see in the West today, and the West has achieved tremendous power and prosperity in the world. The dominant force of human history for the last hundreds and hundreds of years has been Western civilization. But we see spirituality wanes, like you see in Europe today. The source of Christianity that comes out of Europe is the least Christian place in the world today. Christianity is now thriving in Africa and South America much more than is anywhere in Europe. Same thing in the Roman Empire. Romans are, and today, like people, that old time religion doesn't give me it anymore. I'm looking for something new. So, like you see in the West today, people go for Eastern religions. That's something exotic, or like Wiccanism, or anything like that. So anything different. So too, this is what exactly nothing new under the sun. This is exactly what is happening in the Roman Empire. Um, the Roman historian Varro says that by the first century before the Common Era, the Romans had in excess of 30,000 gods. It's an exaggeration. They maybe had 3,000. It's funny, the Romans had like 156 religious holidays a year, yet they constantly ragged on the Jews for taking one day a week off. So everyone's worshiping this world full of gods and isn't doing anything, but also the society is crumbling from within. Morality is collapsing. There's a lot of promiscuity in the Roman Empire with a lot of problems with families falling apart, just like you see today. People are spiritually searching. People are unhappy. They may have a lot of good stuff. That's what you see today, too. People have stuff and they have a nice car and
Right.
a nice TV and a nice house, but their marriage sucks. Their kids hate them. This is nothing new at all. So they're looking. And we know in the Roman Empire of the first century, they're like what's very popular offshoot religion of Zoroastrianism is called Mithraism. It was involved in this. It's called the bull cult of Mithra,
Hmm.
and it's very popular amongst Roman soldiers as a cultic religion. That's a break. It's not mainstream Roman religion, which was emperor worship and all that stuff.
Right.
And Judaism is also very, very popular to a certain extent, because unlike the Roman Empire, where the gods are these licentious people who are like steroid powered characters in a telenovela, the promiscuity and the violence of the big guys upstairs in the God world was horrible. And they didn't care about you, and they cynically used you, and they didn't give you any you didn't get anything out of it. So Judaism, on the other hand, had this incredible loving God who kind of was directing humanity a certain way. And again, if you lived in every major urban center in the Greek Roman world, Alexandria in Egypt, in Rome, Cyrene, North Africa, you lived in where's Turkey today, you'd come across Jews, because once we leave the land of Israel, we're very urbanized people. And we really stuck out, like men are from Mars, women are from Venus kind of things. Everyone else is swapping gods like baseball cards and going to the temples. And there are these Jews who are not going to any of these things. They have the largest religious site in the world before it was destroyed, was the temple in Jerusalem, by the way, which had no
Wow.
images or idols in it. That's unheard of.
Right.
Images of idols and gods and mythological scenes are permeate everything in the ancient world, every bathhouse and temples, and people had little shrines in their house and walked around with little idols in their pockets. And these Jews have this one invisible loving God who controls history and cares about us. And they have this like soul food, and they have a
Right.
day off, and they have social welfare infrastructure, and they have a sense of community in a world which seemed very callous, and people, it's like living in an apartment building, you don't know your neighbors. Jews seem like pretty nice neighbors. And we see this from Roman sources and early Christian sources, all of these around the Mediterranean basin. They're called God-fearers, that are kind of like pagan groupies of Jews who, while not necessarily converting, are like trying to get invited to Shabbos meals, showing up at the synagogues, going to the Kiddush club, that kind of stuff. So this is what's
It's
going
it's
on.
it's so interesting to me too, just in terms of thinking about like again, if you were going to create a religion, right, from the top down, you would want to fill it with opportunities for power without responsibility, which I think is what we see. The Roman gods or the gods of the day, the pharaohs, it's like we get all the power, but we have no responsibility for anybody that we take care of, like, or that we lord over, pun intended. Whereas like Judaism comes along and says, no, we have a God that has both power and responsibility. Like this is going to be a relationship where we care for each other, and the type of leadership is going to be in service both to us and to the world to make it better, but then from us to God. Like it just creates a totally
Yeah.
different dynamic that you can only like envisage either as a bottom up system, like where people would say, well, if I had a God, I would want it to not just be, all powerful, but also loving and caring. And it's just such a different paradigm for like the type of God that we imagine, which I don't think the ancient world could have even thought of at that time. Gods were, like the things that ordered you around, but didn't give a crap how your life was otherwise.
Exactly, exactly. So, and again, we don't appreciate this because we live in a world, even as Jews, which is so permeated with the Jewish view of a God, whether he has parts, the whole idea of Jesus, this loving, caring being who died for your sins. That idea was like, oh my God, that's a ridiculous idea. And that the idea of a God, you're supposed to emulate the God by being godly and charitable. And this is like, we have no idea how radical this was in a world that so needed that stuff. And by the way, Judaism has not a proselytizing faith in general. We actually make it hard to convert. We push people away because we have a very inclusive vision that you don't have to be Jewish to go to heaven, so there's no need to do it. Judaism is not about conquering the world. I always say the only Jewish empire in history has been Hollywood, and it's certainly not a source of Jewish values. But there were definitely Jews who were proselytizing. And we know this again. There's a lot of historical evidence for this because already by the we're talking about mid second century, but latest, like 139 or something like that, we already have Jews being banned from BCE. We have Jews being banned from the city of Rome for proselytizing. So there are
Wow.
definitely Jews in the Mediterranean who are reaching out to pagans and recognizing, well, we got is a lot better than whether you have. The best example, and this is everyone, people should check this out, is a man by the name of Philo Judaeus of Alexandria in Egypt, who lived, he was born before the Common Era to the Common Era, and he died in the early first century. And he was kind of like a modern Orthodox Jew of his day. I would say he was a Hellenized Jew of his day. I mean, he was an observant Jew, very influenced by Greek culture, very much interested on a philosophical level of comparing Greek worldview to Jewish worldview on a philosophical level, not the lifestyle. He had a massive following in the pagan world, much more than in the Jewish world. He was far more influential. He's a really influential personality. If he were alive today, when we have not BC before computers, but in the computer age, he would be like Joe Rogan. He'd be like up there. And his message, I mean, we could do a whole class on Philo. He's such an interesting guy. But his message is paganism is dying. Judaism is the way of the future, and you should all join. And clearly, this is what is going on. So there's a lot of people who are moving towards Judaism and attracted to Judaism. So then the question is, okay, so why didn't the Roman Empire become Jewish? There's there's a little like nursery rhyme that goes, roses are reddish, violets are bluish. If it wasn't for Paul, we'd all be Jewish. That's not exactly true, but Paul plays a big role in that. And to understand that, Ellie, we have to understand that as much as Judaism presented certain very positive things to the average Hellenized, Romanized citizen of the Mediterranean living, especially in major urban centers. By the way, members of the Roman royal family, some of them were executed for conversion. You have people like the famous translator, Onkelos Hager, the famous translator of the Bible into Aramaic, which was one of the international languages of the Mediterranean, along with Greek, was in Jewish tradition the grandnephew of the Roman Emperor Titus.
Oh.
So, so there's definitely people doing it, but it's not taking off because it's attractive as Judaism was in certain respects. Like a lot of people buy kosher food today who are not even Jewish because they think it's healthier and it's soul food. There were aspects of Judaism that were not attractive to the average pagan of the Mediterranean, even the upper class ones of thousands of years ago. One was that Judaism is not just a religion, it's a national identity. It's not just a faith. It's not a way of mode of worship or spirituality. It's a national identity. We've mentioned this before. And the Jews were the people who rebelled more against the Roman Empire than any other people in the history of the Roman Empire. We had three major revolts in the space of 70 years. 66 to 70, the Great Revolt that led to the destruction of Jerusalem. We had a thing called Kitos's War, Roman Quietists from 115 to 117, which tore up the whole Eastern Mediterranean, led to the destruction of whole Jewish communities in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then we had the biggest of all the revolts in the history of the Roman Empire, the Bar Kokhba revolt from 132 to 135, which we now know took all or part of 14 Roman legions to crush, which was, the Romans only had 24 legions in the entire empire.
Wow.
So the Jews had cost the Romans more manpower and material losses than any other people, and were considered a people permanently in revolt. So to become Jewish was to take like the citizenship of an enemy state. But not only that, Judaism has a lot of laws. It's not just the Ten Commandments.
Right.
And especially the laws related to sexuality and who and what you can sleep with and stuff like that, way too much for the average Greek Roman citizen of the Mediterranean.
Right.
So
It's a
then we
religion
have
of
to switch over.
responsibility where we say if you're going to have a good relationship, then you got to do the work. It can't just be that you just, every now and then bring home
Yeah,
flowers and
yeah.
everything's going to be fine.
Right, right. It comes with a lot of responsibility being Jewish. I say Judaism might not be comfortable, but it's meaningful, but you got to work at it. God demands a lot from us. He wants us to be godlike. And I always say is a B.F. Skinner guy. He's a behavioral
Yeah,
modification guy.
so
A
true.
person goes after their actions. Like talk is cheap. Put your money where your mouth is. But the Jewish influence is really strong. The Roman writer Seneca, who lived in the first century CE, he writes, this abominable nation, these are the people always revolting, has succeeded in spreading its customs throughout all the lands. The conquered have given their laws to the conquerors. And he doesn't mean it literally, but he means the Jewish influence is just seeping in everywhere. But then along comes the character who is, Jesus is the central figure in Christian theology, but the personality who's responsible for really creating the seeds of what is modern Christianity as a separate faith is Saul, Tarsus. And what we know about him is from what he writes about himself, that he was a Pharisaic persecutor of early Judeo-Christianity. like the rabbis who were going after these splinter sects. But on the road to Damascus, Syria, Jesus appears to him. He claims to have a vision. He says, "Why are you persecuting my followers?" And he does a 180, and he becomes the great advocate of Christianity. What Paul does is the single greatest marketing move ever. He basically decides that, you know, okay, pagans who wanted to join this Judeo-Christian faith until that time had to convert to Judaism and be circumcised. They were men, which is something definitely the Romans are not going to do. Another big obstacle was the circumcision thing. But they also have to accept the Torah and keep all the commandments,
Right.
and they're not going to do that. So he basically says the big innovation is that we're going to replace deed
Hmm.
with creed.
Got it.
Deed with
Right.
creed. And that means that belief in Jesus replaces the keeping of the commandments. So you just have to believe that he is this, that he is the,
Right.
the Redeemer, and that is brilliant because
Yeah, that's
he
fascinating
removes
because
the
that
big.
really is the defining factor, right? When we think about the difference, like in Christianity, they say just believe as long as you say you believe in Jesus, then you're in. Whereas in Judaism, you have to do the mitzvahs and the commandments. So it's a really, really different. That's so fascinating. I never heard that. Like deed for creed just wraps it up so clearly. That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
And then you get the best of both worlds. You get the loving, caring God. You get the salvation without all the work and without the national connection. So it becomes a universal faith, which, by the way, is far more threatening to Rome. Rome doesn't like Jews because Jews rebel. But Judaism is a tolerated religion in the Roman Empire as long as you paid your tax, your fiscus Judaicus. But Christianity, since Rome, like you mentioned before, it was part of the state religion of Rome was worshiping the emperor as a god. Think about the power it gives the empire to control you in this world and the spiritual realm. This is very threatening. And the early history of the church is the Romans going after these Christians and persecuting them like crazy. And Christianity learned from Judaism the idea of martyrdom. Jews are the first people in the world to die for their faith. People used to die for their family and their farm, but no one died for their faith except Jews. And Christianity turns it into literally an art form, a literary art form. And you can even see paintings of it, like Saint Stephen with all the arrows sticking in him and everything like that. Even the whole Jesus, that's martyrdom, crucifixion.
Right. Right.
So, but and off and on now. I mean, we're gonna have to do part three here, I think, because
Yeah, I
we're
think
gonna
so
have to
too.
get to a certain place to stop. But
So much to
but
cover. It's
but
great.
what happens at this period of time also is it's called the parting of the ways, the great separation, as it's called, which in and of itself is a fascinating topic because as more and more uh, polytheists, pagans are pouring into the faith, and they become the majority of the faith. And at this period of time, to simplify it, is a huge conversation. Basically, gets to the point where now the pagan converts to this new Judeo-Christianity say to the Jews, the authentic Jews who are still in this faith, look, if belief in Jesus replaces the keeping of the law, then either stop keeping the law and stay with us and do what we're doing, or get out. So it's either become, and this is the separation where it starts to
Mm,
split into a separate faith. That's happening internally within the breakaway, the parting of the ways, the great separation. But also with the Romans, if you know the history of off and on for several centuries, the Romans will viciously persecute Christians, and arrest them and crucify them and feed them to lions and watch them kill each other in the Colosseum and things like that. But you
right.
know what they say? If you can't beat them, join them. So the last figure we could talk about before breaking this section is Constantine. Now, Constantine the Great, the emperor, he's the one who in 330 of the Common Era will split the Roman Empire into two parts. This is already past the peak of the Roman Empire. The traditional capital of the Western Latin-speaking Roman Empire is the city of Rome. And then they'll create a city called Constantinople, which is today the city of Istanbul on the Bosporus there in the year 330, and basically you'll have an emperor in both sides. By the way, just a little fast forward, by 475 of the Common Era, the Western Roman Empire of Rome is finally overwhelmed by various Germanic, Ostrogoths and Visigoths. They depose the emperor, and that ceases in 475. That Eastern Empire in Constantinople, which is Greek speaking and based in the East, is going to survive all the way until 1453, another 1,000 years longer. Now,
Wow.
Constantine himself is a very interesting character. He himself is a pagan. There's a story about how in a battle he was fighting that he sees the image of the cross in the sky, and it's an epiphany moment for him. And the reality is, as most historians would hold, that Constantine himself was not a Christian. He just realized that it's much easier since the old state religion seems to be dying out. And this Christianity stuff seems to be an unstoppable force. You can't beat him, join him. In 312 of the Common Era, he issues an edict of toleration, which is basically no more religious persecution of anyone, but it's primarily focusing on Christianity. We're going to stop persecuting Christians. And a dozen years later, around 325, it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And then you have the first great conclave of Christianity, which is in a place in Syria called Nicaea in 325, which is when all the different people from the different churches, because Christianity is an evolved faith, come together in 325 and try and basically figure out what is Christianity. The biggest thing of discussion is the nature of Jesus.
Hmm.
Is he separate from God? Which is read about the Arian heresy. He was the bishop of Carthage going in North Africa. Those are called Monophysites. They have like a God and Jesus and God are separate versus the Trinitarians, which is what virtually all Christians are today. And we know who
Mhm.
won that debate. The
Right.
Trinitarians won the debate. Now, Constantine himself, they say on his deathbed he may have converted, but his mother, Helena, was a very religious Christian, and
That's what I
she's
was
the
going
one
to
who will
ask because
visit
I
you.
seem to remember
Yeah.
something about his mother, and that probably also had a big part to play in the direction that he
Right.
went,
But
which
th
is fascinating.
Right, and this will now she will come to Jerusalem, and she's the one who has all the visions of where all the stories happen in terms of the arrest and trial and crucifixion and burial and resurrection of Jesus. That's the Via Dolorosa, the Stations of the Cross we have today. That, by the way, changes the status of Jerusalem dramatically. From the destroyed, occupied capital of the most rebellious people in the Roman Empire to now Hagia Paulus, a holy city. Rome is the holiest city, but a holy
Right.
city where Jesus is arrested and tried. He visits the temple and he's crucified, buried, and resurrected. So that's going to, and all of this, of course, has big implications now that there's a split and a schism between the two faiths. For the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, which will prove to be very tumultuous and difficult and lead to some of the most nasty hatred of Jews will come out of the church, which is a great question, by the way. You'd think since it's so much closer to Judaism than paganism, there should be a lot closer relationship. But as we know in
Right.
psychology and relationships with people, sometimes the people who are really close together, they need a microscope to see the differences of fight the most.
Right.
But to just end with one interesting point, we just have to appreciate that as much as the faith split and as much as it's going to cause the Jewish people a tremendous amount of pain and
Mhm.
persecution, if it wasn't for the Jewish people, even after the destruction of the temple and even living scattered around the world, just doing it better, creating a better vision of a future, a more optimistic vision, a better idea of community and caring, and a whole redemptive concept, which was very attractive. This faith would never have been born. I always say that quote, imitation is the highest form of flattery. I always say that's the shortest class you ever got on the birth of Christianity and liberal democracy. But the person who really said it the best is, let me just end with a quote here. This is John G. Ganger. He wrote a book called Kingdom and Community. And he talks about, and he sums up exactly what I said very nicely. He says, Christianity preserved all of the advantages of its Jewish heritage, but without the only two factors that might otherwise have inhibited its growth: the obligation of the ritual law and the close connection between religion and national identity. By proclaiming that Christ was, quote, the end of the law, unquote, meaning that that believing in him fulfills the law, and by presenting itself to the world as, quote, the new spiritual Israel. We're laying
Mm.
the siege for what's
Right.
called replacement theology that we'll talk about in part three.
Right.
Hellenistic Christianity, which is the early Christianity, the Greek Roman culture of the Mediterranean, was able to reap the political and social fruits that had been sown by 3 centuries of Hellenistic Judaism. So it's almost as if, to use a farming analogy, we plowed the field that enabled a seed to be planted to enable a faith that emerged historically, theologically, in every way out of the Judea of the first century into the major faith that will transform a huge percentage of the world away from polytheism to monotheism and be the number one faith in the world today. So, in many ways, it's a victory for us in
Right.
terms of weaning the world away from polytheism towards God. But as
Right.
we'll see in the next episode, we pay a very heavy price for it.
It's a bad deal and a good deal. Interesting.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So part three coming up. I mean, look, it is such a long, ancient, and storied history, especially to try to understand the relationship between the Christian world and the Jewish world today, which is complicated. It's good and it's not, and it's easy and it's not. So, yeah, lots to go through. All right. Amazing. As always, please, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. The information is in the liner notes. If you want to see us actually having this conversation, you can check it out on Rabbi Ken Spiro's YouTube channel. So go ahead and look for all of our episodes on there. Please send us a comment or a like or a review on Spotify or Apple or wherever you're listening to us. And if you have topic suggestions, we always love hearing from you. So get in touch. Thanks, as always, Rabbi Conspiro. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, Ellie.